I don't know why I'm recording this now. That's not true. I do know. I just don't like the reason. The official reports don't say what I saw, and the unofficial ones were never written down. They stayed in my head, where things don't stay still. I've learned that if I don't say it out loud, it starts rearranging itself. I'm not doing this for an investigation or a hearing. I'm doing it because some things don't let you stop thinking about them once they've noticed you. I was a state wildlife warden for Louisiana for 17 years. Most of that time was spent in places people don't visit unless something's gone wrong. Backwater stretches, private land disputes, injured animals, poaching complaints that turn out to be nothing but old men and old grudges. I learned early how to tell the difference between fear and imagination. I learned how animals move when they're curious, when they're hungry, when they're threatened. There are patterns. Even chaos has habits. Bayou Terrebonne never followed those habits. If you've never been there, you probably picture something flat and wet and green, maybe slow water and trees leaning in on each other. That's close enough for people who don't stay long. What you don't picture is how enclosed it feels. How the water doesn't open things up but closes them off. Channels that look wide from a map narrow once you're in them. Sound doesn't travel right. You can hear something behind you and never be sure how far away it is, or if it's moving at all. I worked that bayou on and off for years. It wasn't a problem area. No big incidents, no reputation. That's important. Places with reputations prepare you. Bayou Terrebonne didn't ask for attention. It just waited. The first time I noticed the eyes, I didn't register them as anything worth remembering. That's another thing I need to say clearly. I didn't feel terror. I didn't feel like I was in danger. I felt watched in the way you sometimes do when you're alone in a place that isn't empty, even if it looks like it should be. The feeling passes. You tell yourself it's the environment doing what environments do. I was wrong about what kind of watching it was. I've replayed that night enough times that it's hard to tell what's memory and what's repetition. The heat was heavy, even for late summer. The air didn't move. I remember thinking the insects were quieter than they should have been, but that happens sometimes. Cycles shift. You don't assume meaning every time nature changes its rhythm. If you did, you'd never get any work done. I cut the engine and let the boat drift. That was standard. You stop. You listen. You look for signs you'd miss while moving. I swept the light across the waterline and the brush. When the beam hit the trees, something reflected it back. A small point of brightness, low to the ground. Then another, a little higher. Then more, scattered in a way that didn't immediately make sense. Eyes reflect light. That's not unusual. Gators, raccoons, deer. You learn the heights. You learn the spacing. These didn't settle into anything familiar. They didn't blink. They didn't flinch when the beam passed over them. They stayed where they were, like markers. I remember thinking it was strange, but not alarming. Strange things happen when you're tired. I told myself that out loud, which I don't usually do. I said it was probably a trick of the water, or reflections stacking on top of each other. I moved the light away and back again. The eyes were still there. Not real. Real, not real. That phrase wasn't something I'd ever said before. It came out on its own, like a way of checking myself. I didn't feel panicked when I said it. I felt methodical. That's what worries me now, looking back. I treated it like a routine problem. I shifted my position in the boat. The water lapped softly against the hull. The eyes shifted too. Not all at once. Not in a scatter like animals spooking. They adjusted, one by one, keeping their distance, keeping their alignment. Always just beyond where the light was strongest. I don't remember how long I stood there. Time does something different when you're focused on not reacting. Eventually, I convinced myself there was nothing actionable there. No violation. No immediate threat. I logged the area and moved on. I didn't write anything about the eyes. That's another thing that bothers me. I was thorough. I wrote down details other wardens thought were excessive. Weather, water level, animal behavior. That night's report was clean. Too clean. When I read it now, it feels like it belongs to someone else. In the days after, I caught myself thinking about Bayou Terrebonne more than I needed to. That's normal too. You revisit places in your head. You replay odd moments until they lose their edge. Except this one didn't. It stayed exactly the same. The eyes didn't blur or fade with repetition. They stayed precise. I started noticing other things then. Small absences. Areas where birds should have been but weren't. Tracks that ended without dispersing. The sense that when you stopped moving, something else did too. Always just out of sight. I told myself it was stress. End-of-season fatigue. That's what you tell yourself when you don't want to open a door you can't close again. I didn't talk to anyone about it. Not my partner. Not other wardens. I didn't want it shaped by other people's reactions. I needed to know what it felt like unshared. Sometimes at night I'd wake up convinced I'd heard water where there shouldn't have been any. Other times I'd wake up sure I hadn't been asleep at all. The phrase came back then, quieter, like it was being tested. Not real. Real. Not real. I'm aware that this sounds like the beginning of a story that explains itself later. I need to be clear about something before I stop this part. At this point, there was nothing to explain. No theory. No fear I could point to. Just a growing awareness that Bayou Terrebonne wasn't indifferent to me anymore. That's the part that matters. Places don't have to be hostile to be dangerous. Sometimes they just need to notice you once. The next time I went into Bayou Terrebonne, I told myself it was for work. It was. There were calls coming in about illegal lines, abandoned traps, a couple of reports that sounded like bored people inventing trouble. But I volunteered for that stretch. I asked for it in a way that made it sound routine, like I was just saving someone else the drive. I've been thinking about that too, how quick I was to put myself back in the same water. Not real. Real. Not real. I kept saying it under my breath while I checked my gear. I didn't need a mantra. I needed an excuse to feel steady. I told myself that if I went back in daylight, everything would look ordinary again, and the memory would get embarrassed and shrink. Daylight does that. It exposes the shape of things. It turns a threat into a branch, a whisper into insects, a shadow into distance. Bayou Terrebonne did not embarrass itself in daylight. I launched just after sunrise. The air was already thick, the kind of humidity that makes your shirt cling before you've even moved. My boat cut through water that looked like coffee with old cream in it. The surface held a shine that didn't match the sky. The first time I noticed that, years ago, I assumed it was tannins and silt. That morning I caught myself staring down into it longer than I should have, waiting to see if my reflection would settle into place. It didn't. It kept shifting, like the water couldn't agree with my face. I radioed in my location out of habit. Dispatch answered, clear enough, though there was a moment of static that stretched longer than normal. I told myself it was the trees. The bayou eats signals. Everyone knows that. But as I eased deeper in, the world narrowed in the way it always does there, and the quiet started building earlier than it should have. There are silences in the woods that feel natural, like the pause between birds, and there are silences that feel like something has leaned close to listen. I came up on the first set of traps near a stand of cypress, where the water ran shallow. The traps weren't sprung. The bait was still there, untouched, not even worried at. That's not normal. Animals don't ignore food unless something is wrong with it or something has made them cautious. I checked the bait. It was fine. No human scent. No chemical smell. Just meat and oil and time. The trap chain had been moved, dragged a few feet, then set again. There were marks in the mud that looked like something heavy had shifted it, but not in the sloppy way a gator might roll through. The lines were too straight, like someone had taken their time. I looked for footprints. The mud held nothing I could call a boot print. It held impressions that didn't commit to being anything. A shallow curve. A pressed-down crescent. Places where something had stood long enough to sink, but not long enough to leave edges. That's the kind of detail you'd ignore if you were in a hurry. I wasn't in a hurry. A heron should have lifted off when I rounded the bend. There was usually one there, a pale shape that always looked like it was balancing on patience. But the branch was empty. The air above it was empty too. No wing beats, no retreating motion. Just absence, like a photograph where someone's been cut out. I checked another trap line deeper in. Same thing, bait untouched. Chain shifted. Nothing damaged, nothing stolen. Like someone had been practicing rearranging things without making a mess. That was the first moment the thought came clearly. The one I didn't want. Something knows what I do here. I stayed professional. That's the thing about being a warden. You fall back on procedure when your mind tries to run ahead. I logged the conditions. I took photos. I marked coordinates. I wrote myself reminders in shorthand that didn't name what I was thinking. If anyone ever read my field notes, it would look like routine diligence. But the bayou doesn't care about your routine diligence. Around mid-morning the heat settled hard. The canopy held it down. Sweat ran into my eyes. My gloves stuck to my palms. I motored toward a narrow channel that cut between two thick walls of brush. I'd been through it before. It always felt tight, but this time it felt like it had tightened further, like the growth had leaned inward while I was away. That's ridiculous, of course. Plants don't move that fast. Trees don't conspire. Not real. Real. Not real. I killed the engine at the mouth of the channel and drifted. A habit. Listen. Watch. The water hissed softly against roots. The air smelled like rotten green life. Somewhere far off, something splashed. One distinct sound, then nothing after it. No ripples reached me. No follow-up movement. Just one splash, as if to remind me water existed. I shined my light out of reflex, then stopped myself. It was full day. The beam looked stupid in sunlight. I turned it off, embarrassed, then realized my hand had done it without consulting me. I looked into the brush. The shadows under the leaves were thick, almost black. Sometimes you can see into them if you let your eyes adjust. Sometimes you can't. I waited, letting my vision settle. That was when I saw the first glint. Just a pinprick, low and steady. Too bright for a bead of water. Too fixed to be sunlight hitting a leaf. It sat there in the dark like a nailhead catching light. Then another, a few feet to the right. Then another, not scattered like random reflections. Arranged in a loose curve, as if something had turned its head and I was seeing where it had looked from. I leaned forward. The boat barely rocked. My breath sounded too loud. The points didn't blink. They didn't dart away. They held. I told myself, calmly, that it was probably spiders. You get eye shine from spider eyes if the angle is right. You can get dozens of little points if you sweep a beam across grass at night. But this wasn't night, and I wasn't sweeping. I was looking at stillness that looked back. I lifted my binoculars. The glass fogged instantly, then cleared in patches. When I focused, the points of light became not eyes exactly, not in a way that made sense. They were too smooth, too round, too deliberate. And they weren't all at the same depth. Some were deeper in the brush, some closer, different heights, different distances. But they were aligned, like they were standing in rows, angled toward me, patient. I swallowed and forced myself to blink. When I opened my eyes again, the points were still there. That's the difference between imagination and something that doesn't care what you believe. Imagination disappears when you demand it. This did not. I did not fire a weapon. I did not shout. I did not speak to it. I did what I'm trained to do when I don't understand an animal. I made myself bigger in the safest way I could. I stood up slowly in the boat. I raised my arms. I made motion without aggression. The points of light rose, not all of them, enough to notice. A slow adjustment upward, like a response. Like it was mirroring what I did, not copying exactly, but acknowledging. My stomach went cold in the heat. I lowered my arms. The points lowered too, but not fully. They stayed a little higher than before, like they'd learned a new position. Not real. Real. Not real. I backed the boat out of the channel without turning. My hands were steady because I forced them to be. That's what people don't understand about fear. Sometimes the body goes quiet, not loud. Sometimes it gets efficient. I didn't run the engine until I was out where the water widened again. Even then, I kept looking back over my shoulder, expecting to see movement, expecting to see a shape break from the brush. Nothing did. The points of light weren't visible anymore, either because the angle changed or because they didn't want to be seen from there. I returned to the main route, telling myself I'd document it. I'd note possible illegal activity. I'd come back with another warden and treat it as a people problem, because people problems have solutions. But when I tried to call dispatch, my radio answered in my own voice, not exactly. It was close enough that my mind stumbled. The same cadence I use when I'm tired, the same clipped vowels, even the slight rasp from years of shouting over engines and wind. My call sign came back at me, repeated once, then again, each time flatter, like a recording being copied until the edges disappear. I stared at the radio, thumb hovering over the button, not pressing, not releasing, the channel filled with quiet static that sounded like leaves rubbing together. Then the radio went dead. I should have turned around right then. Left the bayou and filed a report, and never came back alone. Instead, I checked the battery. I checked the antenna. I checked the connections like a man trying to fix a normal problem. All the while, I could feel the bayou behind me, holding its breath. I stayed out there longer than I should have. That's the part I still argue with myself about. I tell myself it was responsibility, that I couldn't just leave equipment unchecked or ignore possible human interference. Other days, I admit it felt like leaving would have been an admission. As long as I stayed, whatever had noticed me hadn't won anything yet. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase had started to feel worn, like a coin rubbed thin. It didn't reassure me anymore. It just marked time. I took a longer route back, following a winding stretch that paralleled an old logging cut. The maps still show it, a pale line where machines once passed through and then abandoned the effort. On the ground, it's barely there. Trees reclaim it in uneven ways, growing too close together, like they're closing ranks. The water there is shallow and slow, and it carries a smell that's older than rot. Something mineral. Something sealed away. As I moved, I started to notice how quiet the bayou had become. Not empty quiet. Held quiet. The kind where sound feels like it would be rude if you made too much of it. Even the engines sounded intrusive. a vibration that didn't belong. I throttled down without thinking, letting momentum carry me. That's when I realized I hadn't seen another boat all morning. That alone wasn't unusual. Bayou Terrebonne isn't busy. But I should have seen signs of passage, wake lines, broken surface patterns. Something. The water behind me smoothed itself almost immediately, like it didn't want to remember I'd been there. I cut the engine again and let myself drift. The boat nudged gently against submerged roots. I leaned over and pushed off with a pull. The pull met resistance sooner than expected. Not bottom, but something springy, like it had pressed against a mass of vegetation that hadn't been there on previous patrols. I didn't look down right away. I don't know why. Maybe some part of me didn't want to see the water that close. When I did look, I saw only darkness under the surface, a thickness that swallowed light instead of bending it. I straightened and scanned the tree line. The eyes were there again, closer this time. Not in the same configuration as before. They weren't lined up in a curve. They were staggered, irregular, some low, some high, some so deep in shadow they were barely more than the suggestion of reflection. But there were more of them. Enough that I couldn't count without losing track. I didn't feel the urge to shout. I felt the urge to catalog. That's another thing training does to you. It gives your mind something to do when it doesn't want to accept what's in front of it. Height, spacing, distance, movement. There was movement now, but it was subtle. A slight sway, like a body adjusting weight. A slow lateral shift that stopped the moment I focused on it directly. When I looked at one set of eyes, the others seemed to creep. When I tried to watch them all at once, nothing moved at all. I realized then that I was breathing shallowly, like I was underwater. I forced myself to inhale deeply. The smell of the bayou filled my lungs, thick and layered. Something in it made my throat itch, like pollen or dust. I raised my camera. The screen stayed black. I tapped it, checked the power. Nothing. The battery had been full that morning. I remember, because I always check. I lifted my GPS unit next. It flickered, showed a location that didn't make sense, then reset itself and went blank. I laughed once, short and sharp, and immediately regretted it. The sound felt wrong in my mouth. It didn't carry the way it should have. It fell straight down, like it had weight. The eyes didn't react to the laugh. They didn't react to anything I did, not directly. They just stayed where they were. Attentive. That's the word that comes back when I think about them. Not hostile. Not curious. Attentive. Like an audience that had already been there for a while before I noticed them. I said out loud that this was illegal activity. That anyone out there should identify themselves. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. It echoed oddly, stretched thin between the trees. Nothing answered. Then something changed, and it was small enough that I almost missed it. The insects came back, not all at once. One chirp, then another, then the low buzz of wings. It built into something like normalcy, like the bayou was correcting itself. I felt a wave of relief so strong it made my knees weak. See, I told myself. That's how you know. Things don't stay wrong forever. The relief lasted maybe 5 seconds. Because the insects weren't everywhere. They were behind the eyes. The brush around the points of light stayed silent, dead still, while the world beyond them resumed its noise. It drew a line I couldn't stop seeing. On one side, life. On the other, something that didn't need it. Not real. Real, not real. I backed the boat again, slow and controlled. The water resisted me more than it should have, like pushing through a crowd that doesn't want to part. My pull met resistance again, and this time I felt it slide along something smooth before catching on a root. When I pulled it free, there was nothing on it. No plant matter. No mud. Just wet wood. Clean. I didn't turn my back. I don't know how long I kept my eyes on the tree line as I moved. Long enough for my neck to ache. Long enough for my vision to blur at the edges. I was dimly aware that this posture wasn't sustainable, that at some point I'd have to choose a direction and commit to it. That choice was made for me when the water behind the boat rippled. I felt it before I saw it. A shift in balance. A pressure against the hull. I froze. The ripples spread outward in neat rings, too neat. Something had displaced the water carefully, like it didn't want to draw attention. I looked down. There were no eyes in the water. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. The surface reflected the trees, the sky, the underside of my boat. It reflected everything except me. Where my shape should have been, there was a distortion, a smear, like the water couldn't agree on what it was looking at. I straightened slowly, afraid that if I moved too fast I'd confirm something I wasn't ready to know. When I looked back at the tree line, some of the eyes were gone, not retreated. Gone, like lights switched off. Others remained, fewer now, but brighter, more focused. They seemed closer than before, though I hadn't seen them move. The radio crackled once, sharp enough to make me flinch. Then, nothing. I made the decision then. I told myself it was about safety, about protocol. Alone, no communication, equipment failing. That's enough justification. I turned the boat fully and started the engine. As I pulled away, I felt it again, that sense of being paced. Not followed. Accompanied. At a distance that never changed, no matter how fast or slow I went. The bayou narrowed, widened, twisted, and the feeling stayed exactly where it was, like a fixed measurement. I didn't look back again. I kept my eyes forward, on the water ahead, on the turns I knew by heart. My hands shook once, then steadied. When I finally broke out into a wider stretch and saw open sky, I let myself breathe properly for the first time in what felt like hours. I told myself I'd leave Bayou Terrebonne for someone else next time. I told myself I'd file a report that made sense to people who needed things to make sense. I told myself a lot of things on the ride back. That night, when I cleaned my gear, I found mud on the inside of my boots. I don't remember stepping out of the boat. After that day, Bayou Terrebonne started appearing in places it didn't belong. Not in dreams exactly. I don't like calling them dreams because they didn't follow the rules. Dreams wander. These stayed fixed. They had edges. I'd close my eyes and see the same stretch of water, the same tree line from the same angle, as if my mind had been given a photograph it couldn't put down. Not real. Real. Not real. I went back to work the next morning like nothing had happened. That's another thing people don't talk about. You don't always stop functioning when something breaks inside you. Sometimes you function better, tighter, like a knot pulled too far. I filed a report that mentioned equipment malfunctions, possible unauthorized activity, and unusual environmental conditions. I avoided specifics. I avoided language that would get me pulled off duty or laughed out of the office. No one questioned it. Bayou Terrebonne didn't have a history. It didn't raise flags. But other things started to. Over the next week, I noticed names coming up more often in briefings. Small things at first. A missing recreational fisherman who hadn't returned by dusk. A trapper whose lines were found cut and neatly coiled on shore. A man who'd gone in looking for feral hogs and never checked back out. None of it made the news. It rarely does. People go missing in places like that, and the assumption is always the same. Water, weather, bad judgment. I found myself looking at the maps differently, not tracing routes but staring at gaps, places where searches had turned back. places marked as inaccessible or too unstable for sustained effort. Bayou Terrebonne had more of those than I remembered. I asked around, casually. Other wardens, older ones who'd been there longer than me. I didn't mention eyes. I didn't mention watching. I asked if anyone else had ever had equipment fail out there, or felt like the bayou was off. Most shrugged. A few laughed and said all bayous are off if you stare at them long enough. One man didn't laugh. He'd been with the department longer than I had. He was quiet, methodical, the kind of person who only spoke when he had something worth the air. When I mentioned Terrebonne, his mouth tightened just enough that I noticed. He told me his grandfather used to fish there. Used to, being the important part. Said the old man stopped suddenly one year and never explained why. Just said the bayou was getting crowded. Crowded with what, I asked. The warden looked at me for a long moment before answering. With watchers, he said. That's the word his grandfather used. Watchers. Not animals. Not spirits. Just watchers. Things that didn't interfere unless they were acknowledged. I laughed then, too loud. I regret that. It broke something in the conversation. He didn't say anything else after that, and I didn't push. But the word stayed with me. Watchers. Not real. Real. Not real. I tried to stay away from Bayou Terrebonne after that. I swapped assignments when I could. I took longer routes. I told myself it was temporary, just until the feeling passed. But avoidance has a way of sharpening things instead of dulling them. The eyes started showing up outside the bayou. The first time, it was in my truck, late evening. I'd pulled over near a drainage canal to make a call. The water there was shallow, concrete-lined, nothing like Terrebonne. As I leaned back in my seat, I caught a reflection in the side mirror, 2 small points of light, steady, low. I turned my head. There was nothing there. When I looked back at the mirror, the points were gone. I sat there longer than necessary, heart steady, hands on the wheel. I told myself it was a passing car, a trick of angle and light. That explanation fit neatly. Too neatly. It slid into place without resistance, which should have been a warning. After that, reflections started misbehaving. Glass doors. Dark windows. The surface of water in a sink. Sometimes my reflection lagged, sometimes it didn't appear at all. Other times it appeared too clearly, staring back with a focus that made my skin crawl. I stopped looking at myself unless I had to. Work got harder. Not because of performance. I was still doing my job. But I felt like I was being evaluated. Not by supervisors or the public. By something that didn't care about my reports or my procedures, only about whether I noticed it back. That's the contradiction I kept circling. The eyes didn't chase, they didn't threaten, they waited. And the more I tried to ignore them, the more present they became, like ignoring them was the wrong answer to a question I didn't understand. I went back to Bayou Terrebonne 3 weeks later. I told myself it was unavoidable. A joint search operation had been organized after a missing person report escalated. A teenager, last seen with friends near one of the deeper channels. Peer pressure, poor decisions, the usual story. I volunteered before anyone else could. I don't know why I did that. Maybe part of me believed that if I went back under official circumstances, with other people, the bayou would behave itself. It did not. We launched in pairs, spread out to cover more ground. I was assigned to a section that cut close to where I'd first seen the eyes. I didn't mention that to my partner. I didn't mention much of anything. He talked enough for both of us, filling the boat with easy noise that felt foreign to me now. As we moved deeper in, I felt the familiar pressure building. The quiet, the way the trees leaned. My partner didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't comment. He kept scanning the water, calling out periodically, his voice bouncing oddly off the banks. We found the teenager's shoe near a snag of roots. One shoe. No sign of a struggle. No blood. No drag marks. Just a shoe placed where it could be seen. That's not how accidents look. We marked the spot and called it in. As my partner spoke into the radio, his words distorted, stretched just slightly, like they were being filtered through something thick. He frowned at the handset, adjusted it, tried again. This time the reply came back clear. I didn't tell him that I'd heard his voice come back before he finished speaking. Not real. Real. Not real. We pushed on. The water grew darker, the channels tighter. I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see the eyes, half dreading and half relieved when they didn't appear. The absence felt deliberate, like a test. Then my partner fell silent. I don't mean he stopped talking. I mean the sound of him stopped existing. I could see his mouth moving. I could see his chest rise and fall. But whatever he was saying didn't reach me. It was like the bayou had drawn a line between us and decided what could cross it. I reached out and grabbed his arm. He startled, yanked back, shouted something I couldn't hear. Then the sound snapped back into place all at once, loud enough to make me wince. He asked me what was wrong. I told him I thought I'd heard something in the brush. That wasn't a lie. We both looked toward the tree line. The brush was thick there, dark and layered. And for just a moment, before my partner shifted his weight and blocked my view, I saw them again. Not all of them. Just two. Low, steady, watching us. I didn't point them out to my partner. I don't know if that was instinct or cowardice. Maybe I understood, on some level, that once you name something like that out loud, it changes the rules. It stops being yours alone. And I wasn't ready to see what would happen if someone else noticed them too. Not real. Real. Not real. The eyes vanished the moment my partner shifted again. Or maybe they didn't vanish. Maybe I just lost the angle. That uncertainty settled into me like grit, something I couldn't shake out no matter how I moved. We continued the search until late afternoon. Found nothing else. No clothing. No signs of a body. No indication of direction. The official explanation started forming before we even got back to the dock. Drowning. Disorientation. Current. It fit well enough to satisfy paperwork. It didn't fit what I felt in my chest. When we regrouped with the others, I noticed something strange. The conversation stayed surface level, procedural, but there was a tension underneath them that didn't match the situation. People kept glancing toward the water, then away. One warden asked if anyone else's GPs was acting up. Another complained about radio feedback. Small things, shared, but unspoken. No one mentioned eyes. The search wrapped up at dusk. Resources were pulled back. Families were notified with careful language. I watched from a distance, my hands folded uselessly in front of me, while a woman cried into someone's shoulder. I didn't know her name. I didn't ask. That night, I couldn't sleep. That wasn't unusual anymore, but this time, it wasn't the images keeping me awake. It was the sense of being out of place. My house felt wrong, like it had been rearranged when I wasn't looking. The walls seemed closer together. The corners held shadows that didn't match the light sources. I left every lamp on. When I finally did drift off, it was shallow and brittle. I woke at least twice to the feeling of being watched, heart racing, scanning the dark. Each time there was nothing there, no movement, no reflection, just the echo of attention. The next morning there was mud on my porch, not smeared, not tracked, just a patch of it, pressed into the wood like a footprint that hadn't decided on a shape. Damp, dark, smelling faintly of the bayou. I stared at it for a long time before cleaning it up. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't photograph it. I didn't want proof. Proof changes things. At work, The missing person cases kept accumulating. Not always in Terrebonne, but often near it. People who wandered off trails. People who took boats out alone. People who knew the water well enough to feel confident. The pattern wasn't obvious unless you were looking for it. I was. I started pulling old files, quietly. During lunch breaks, after hours. I told myself it was professional curiosity. In truth, I was looking for permission to be afraid. There were older reports that mirrored the newer ones too closely to be coincidence. Missing equipment. Unexplained radio failures. Witness statements that were softened or summarized until they lost their edges. Phrases like felt disoriented or lost track of time appeared more often than they should have. One report caught my attention. Decades old, a warden who'd resigned abruptly after a routine patrol. No disciplinary action, no incident report that justified it. Just a note that he'd requested reassignment and then left the department entirely when it was denied. I tracked down his name. He lived 2 parishes over now. I debated contacting him for days before finally doing it. When he answered the phone, his voice was wary, but not surprised. I didn't mention Bayou Terrebonne right away. I talked around it, about changes in the job, about stress. He let me. When I finally asked if he'd ever had a patrol that made him reconsider everything, there was a long pause. He told me he used to see eyes in the water. Not reflections, not animals. Eyes that stayed where they were no matter how the light moved. Eyes that didn't belong to anything he could identify. He said he stopped going out alone after that. Said it didn't help. He didn't say much more. When I asked him why he left, he said the bayou started showing up in places it shouldn't have. Then he hung up. I sat there with the phone in my hand, listening to the dead line, feeling a cold clarity settle over me. I wasn't imagining this. Or if I was, I wasn't alone in it. Not real. Real, not real. The phrase felt weaker now, like a door that wouldn't close all the way. I went back to Bayou Terrebonne alone after that. I didn't tell anyone. I signed out a boat under a different pretext and launched before dawn. I told myself I needed to see it again on my terms. I needed to understand the rules. The water was unnaturally smooth that morning. No ripples, no insects. The trees reflected perfectly, upside down, forming a second forest beneath the surface. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. As I moved deeper in, I felt that same sense of being measured, evaluated, not threatened, assessed. I stopped the boat in a narrow channel and cut the engine. The silence was immediate and complete, like a switch had been thrown. I waited. The eyes appeared slowly, one by one, blooming in the darkness between the trees. There were more than I'd ever seen before. Enough that I couldn't look at them all without turning my head. I spoke then. I don't remember deciding to. The words came out on their own. I said I saw them, that I understood they were there. The eyes didn't react. The water around the boat shifted, gently. A pressure beneath me, like something settling into place. The reflections in the water distorted, stretched vertically, as if the world were being pulled downward. I felt an overwhelming urge to look down into the water, to meet whatever gaze waited there. Every instinct I had told me not to, that if I did, something irreversible would happen. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in that standoff with myself. Eventually, I broke eye contact with the tree line and stared at the bow of the boat, breathing through clenched teeth. When I looked up again, the eyes were gone. The silence lifted gradually. Insects returned. The world resumed its noise like nothing had happened. I started the engine with shaking hands and left without looking back. That should have been the end of it. A confrontation. a boundary set. Instead, things accelerated. People started asking me questions I couldn't answer. Supervisors noticed my distraction. I missed small details. I caught myself staring at water too long, waiting for it to respond. I stopped being trusted with solo patrols. I didn't argue. At home, the reflections got worse. Mirrors showed rooms I wasn't standing in. Windows reflected movement behind me when there was nothing there. Sometimes, in the dark, I'd catch a glint of light at floor level and feel my stomach drop before realizing it was just my own eyes, reflected back at me. Or maybe it wasn't. Not real. Real. Not real. I started to wonder if the bayou was done with me, or if it was just waiting for me to realize I'd never really left it. The department didn't officially suspend me. They didn't have to. They just stopped assigning me anything that required distance or isolation. Desk work, ride-alongs, training reviews. It was framed as concern. It probably even was. I didn't push back. I was relieved, in a way I didn't like admitting. Being kept close to other people felt safer, even if I couldn't explain why. Not real. Real. Not real. The bayou didn't respect the boundary. It followed me into crowds, into offices, into places where water shouldn't have had any presence at all. I'd be sitting in a briefing room and catch myself tracking the way light reflected off a polished table, waiting for it to distort, waiting for it to lag. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. The inconsistency was worse than certainty. I started noticing how often people went missing without anyone noticing right away. Not just in Terrebonne, but nearby. People who lived alone. People who worked odd hours. People who had reasons not to be missed immediately. The reports never connected them. Different circumstances. Different locations. But the timing clustered, like something had learned how long it could take before absence became a problem. I attended one of the searches as support, stayed on land while others went out on the water. It should have been easier that way. It wasn't. From shore, the bayou looked wider, more open, less claustrophobic. But I could feel the same attention stretched across distance instead of pressing in close. I stood near a stand of trees and watched the water for movement that never came. The surface stayed calm even when boats passed through it, their wakes smoothing out too quickly. Someone joked that the bayou was swallowing evidence. No one laughed. That night, I found mud in my bathtub. I hadn't been out. I hadn't tracked anything in. The bathroom floor was dry. The mud sat in a shallow pool at the drain like it had seeped up from below. I stared at it for a long time, then flushed the tub and watched it swirl away. The water left behind a faint ring that didn't quite wash off. I started locking doors obsessively, checking windows, leaving lights on. None of it mattered. The eyes didn't need entry. They didn't need access. They just needed a surface. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom after I woke up one night and saw the reflection of eyes in the dark television screen. Low. Steady. Exactly where my own would have been if I were standing on the other side of the glass. I slept on the couch after that, facing away from reflective surfaces, though that meant facing the hallway. I told myself that was better. I'm not sure it was. At work, a file crossed my desk that made my hands go cold. A missing juvenile case, officially ruled accidental. The location listed was a stretch of water that fed into Bayou Terrebonne through a series of narrow channels. The boy had been found days later, miles away, in water too shallow to drown in. No injuries, no explanation. The report noted that his eyes were open when he was found. I closed the file and sat there longer than necessary. The phrase came back, automatic now, like a reflex I couldn't suppress. Not real. Real. Not real. I realized then that whatever this was, it wasn't interested in me because I was special. It was interested because I noticed. because I paid attention, because I looked back when I should have looked away. That understanding didn't bring comfort. It brought inevitability. The eyes appeared in my dreams again, but closer now, no longer framed by trees or water. Sometimes they were reflected in glass I couldn't identify. Sometimes they hovered in darkness with no context at all. I'd wake with the certainty that something had been decided while I slept. I stopped recording dates. Stopped keeping track of how long it had been since I'd last gone out on the water. Time started slipping sideways, days overlapping in ways that made it hard to anchor myself. The bayou started to smell like it was inside my house. Damp wood, still water, that mineral note that didn't belong indoors. I scrubbed surfaces until my hands hurt. The smell came back anyway. I caught myself standing in the bathroom one afternoon, staring at the sink, watching the water pool instead of drain. The surface reflected the ceiling light perfectly, too perfectly. For a moment, I had the overwhelming sense that if I leaned closer, I'd see something waiting beneath it. I stepped back hard enough to hit the wall. That was when I decided to leave. Not the department, not the state, just my house. I packed a bag and drove without a plan, telling myself distance would break whatever pattern I'd fallen into. I drove until the landscape changed, until the air dried out and the trees thinned. For a while, it worked. The reflections behaved. The nights were quiet. I started to believe I'd outrun it. Then I stopped at a motel and found the ice machine out back, leaking onto the pavement. The puddle it formed reflected the building lights in a way that made my chest tighten. I stood there too long, staring down, waiting. Nothing happened. The relief was sharp enough to make me dizzy. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to sleep. Sometime before dawn, I woke with a feeling of being watched. Not from the room, from somewhere far away, through layers of distance that didn't matter. I understood then that Bayou Terrebonne wasn't a place anymore. It was a way of being observed. The watchers didn't move. They didn't follow. They didn't pursue. They waited for surfaces. They waited for stillness. They waited for attention. And I had given them too much of it. I'm recording this now because I'm starting to forget what it was like before I noticed. I'm afraid that if I don't leave a record, there won't be any difference between me and the water anymore. Just reflection. I tried to convince myself that recording this was the last thing I needed to do, that once the words were out, they wouldn't have any reason to stay. That's how confessions are supposed to work. You say the thing, and it loosens its grip. You turn a private weight into something external, something you can set down. Not real. Real. Not real. I listened back to the earlier parts once, just once. Hearing my own voice unsettled me more than I expected. There were pauses I didn't remember leaving, places where the cadence slowed, like I was waiting for something to interrupt. It sounded like someone being careful around a sleeping animal. After that, I didn't listen again. I stopped going to work entirely. No official resignation, no dramatic exit. I just faded. Sick days turned into silence. Messages piled up unanswered. Eventually, they stopped coming. People assume things when you don't correct them. Burnout. Breakdown. Another cautionary story about stress and long hours. It was easier for everyone that way. I spent most of my time indoors, curtains drawn, lights on. I avoided reflective surfaces as best I could, though it's impossible to eliminate them completely. Even matte walls catch light at the right angle. Even shadows can shine if you stare long enough. The eyes started appearing without reflections. That's when I understood something had shifted. At first it was peripheral, a sense of focus just outside my line of sight. When I turned my head, there'd be nothing there. But the feeling remained, like pressure against the side of my skull. I'd sit very still, testing it. trying to see if it would fade if I ignored it. It didn't. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of water I hadn't meant to pour. I'd been thirsty, I think, or maybe I just wanted to see if the surface would behave. The water was still. Too still. I remember thinking that it looked like a lens instead of a liquid. That's when I felt it directly. Attention. Not directed at me, exactly, through me. Like I'd become a window someone else was leaning toward. I held my breath without realizing it, afraid that any movement would confirm what I already suspected. I didn't look up. I didn't look down. I kept my eyes fixed on the table, watching the grain of the wood ripple slightly, like it was being seen through water. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase felt thin now. It didn't assert anything anymore. It just repeated. I started hearing sounds that didn't belong anywhere specific. Not voices, not words. The impression of sound, like something being remembered rather than heard. Sometimes it came from behind me. Sometimes it came from inside my head. I stopped trying to locate it. Location stopped meaning much. I thought about the people who'd gone missing. The fisherman. The teenager. The ones whose names were footnotes in reports no one read twice. I wondered how many of them had noticed something before they disappeared. How many had seen the eyes and decided not to talk about it. How many had looked too long. That thought settled into me like a verdict. The bayou wasn't taking people because it was hungry. It wasn't malicious. It was selective. It took those who learned how to see it. And once you learned, there was no unlearning. I began to understand the old stories differently. The ones people tell half joking, half serious, about swamp lights and spirits and watchers in the trees. They're framed as warnings, but they're really descriptions. Attempts to explain something that doesn't explain itself. Watchers, not predators, not gods. Just observers that don't need to move, because everything eventually comes to them. I started catching myself standing very still for long stretches, staring at nothing. Waiting. Waiting for what? I couldn't have said. Sometimes hours would pass without me realizing it. I'd come back to myself with cramped legs and a dry mouth, the sense that I'd been useful in some way I didn't remember agreeing to. That frightened me more than the eyes ever did, because it meant I wasn't just being watched anymore. I was participating. I tried to leave again. Packed my car in the middle of the night and drove until exhaustion forced me to stop. I didn't choose destinations. I avoided water when I could, but it kept appearing anyway. Rain pooled in parking lots. Condensation gathered on windows. Even the sheen on asphalt after a storm felt like too much. Every surface became a risk. At a gas station just before dawn, I caught my reflection in the side of a pump. For a moment, it was normal. Then, the reflection didn't blink when I did. I turned away quickly, heart pounding, and pretended nothing had happened. That was my last attempt at pretending. I started to feel hollowed out, like something had taken up residence behind my eyes and pushed me back a step. I'd speak and hear my voice sound slightly delayed, like it was passing through something before reaching the air. Sometimes I'd answer questions I hadn't been asked yet. I stopped talking to people. That's when I realized the attention felt, satisfied, not gone, just settled. As if I'd reached the state it had been waiting for. I don't know how long I've been in this place now. I stopped marking time. Days don't feel sequential anymore. They stack, overlap. Sometimes I think I'm back in Bayou Terrebonne, standing in the boat, looking at the tree line. Other times I'm certain I've never left my living room. The boundaries don't hold. I've started to notice things through other people's eyes, reflections that aren't mine. Angles I couldn't see from where I'm standing. It happens briefly, like a blink that doesn't belong to me. That's why I'm finishing this part now, not because I'm afraid. Fear implies resistance. This feels more like completion, like something has been assembled carefully, piece by piece, and is nearly done. I don't know what happens after this. I don't know if there is an after. I just know that surfaces are easier to see through than they used to be. That stillness feels inviting instead of dangerous. The eyes don't appear in front of me anymore. They appear behind my thoughts. Watching outward. I'm not sure when this recording became something other than a record. At some point, it stopped feeling like I was documenting what happened and started feeling like I was leaving space. Not a message. A surface. Not real. Real. Not real. The room I'm in now is quiet, in a way that doesn't ask anything of me. The lights are on, but they don't seem to touch the corners. I've moved the furniture so there aren't many angles left. Flat walls. Dull finishes. I thought that might help. I don't know why I thought that. I can feel the stillness settling when I stop talking. It presses in gently, like water finding its level. When I speak, it recedes just enough to let the words pass through. That feels important, like timing matters. I keep thinking about the first night in Bayou Terrebonne, how I stood in the boat and told myself it was nothing. How careful I was not to overreact. I've replayed that restraint over and over, wondering if that was the moment I agreed to something without knowing the terms. There's a gap in my memory now. Not a blackout. More like a blur where details refuse to stick. I know I went places after I stopped working. I know I spoke to people. There are messages on my phone I don't remember sending. Directions I don't remember following. Sometimes I find mud on my shoes and can't place where it came from. I stop trying to clean it. The eyes don't appear the way they used to. That's the part I need to say clearly before this ends or becomes something else. There's no glint in the dark anymore. No reflection lagging behind me in glass or water. If I were to explain it, which I won't, I'd say it's because there's no need. I don't look for them. I notice other things instead. The way people pause when they're near water, even shallow water. The way their reflections seem slightly more attentive than their faces. The way stillness spreads when no one is paying attention to it. I went back through the old files one last time, not to research, just to look. Names blur together now, but I remember the phrasing. Missing, presumed drowned. No signs of foul play. Extensive search yielded no results. I used to read those and think about currents, about panic, about exhaustion. Now I think about attention. I think about who noticed first. Sometimes, when I'm very quiet, I feel like I can see through surfaces the way light does. Not visually. It's harder to describe than that. More like a sense of alignment. Like I'm standing in the right place at the right angle and something lines up briefly. When that happens, I feel useful. That's not a word I like applying to myself in this context, but it's the closest one I have. There's a calm that comes with it. A sense that whatever question was being asked has found an answer that satisfies. Not real. Real. Not real. I don't know what happens to people who disappear anymore. I don't know if they go somewhere or if they simply stop being where we expect them to be. The Bayou taught me that those aren't the same thing. I tried once to write this all down instead of recording it. Pen and paper. Something solid. The words came out wrong. They stacked instead of flowing. The ink reflected light oddly, like it was wet long after it should have dried. I threw the pages away. This feels closer to what's needed. I can feel the attention shift when I speak certain words. Bayou. Water. Still. Watch. I don't emphasize them. I don't linger. I just notice the response. That's how I know this is being received, even if I don't know by what. There's a reflection in the dark screen across the room now. I'm not looking directly at it. I don't need to. I know what's there. It's steady, familiar. It doesn't feel hostile. It feels patient. I understand something now that I didn't before. The watchers don't come to you. They don't arrive. They don't cross distances. They wait for you to become a place they can look out from. A surface. That's why Bayou Terrebonne felt enclosed. Not because it trapped you, but because it was full. Full of angles, full of ways to see without moving. I don't think I'm in danger. That idea doesn't apply anymore. Danger implies an outcome you can avoid. This feels more like a continuation. I keep pausing while I talk, listening for something to interrupt me. It hasn't. The silence is cooperative. It opens when I speak and closes when I stop. I wonder how long that will last. My reflection is very clear now. Clearer than it should be. There's a sense of pressure behind my eyes, not painful, just present, like standing too close to a window and feeling the cold seep in through the glass. I don't pull away from it. Not real. Real. Not real. If someone finds this recording, I don't know what they'll hear. I don't know if it will sound like a warning or a confession or just a man talking too long to an empty room. I don't know if it matters. I do know that the bayou doesn't need a body to be present. It just needs a way to look. The surface of this moment feels very smooth, very still, like water, right before something decides whether or not to break it. I'm going to stop talking now, not because I'm done, just because it feels like the right place to let things settle. If there's silence after this, that doesn't mean nothing is happening. It just means you're not looking at the right angle yet. Not real. Real. Not real.